Okay, I think we are ready to begin. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Good evening. I'm Dr. Clive James Nwonka. I'm a fellow in film studies in the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And welcome to this special event this evening at the South London Gallery. Convergence is a brand new ongoing series of critical conversations, screenings and commissions that are facilitated by the South London Gallery and curated and hosted by a number of guests. And it's a pleasure to be the first person to curate this new series. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we have seen an immediate reaction from a number of public cultural institutions all over the world, from the BBC to CNN to Channel 4 to BAFTA. And this discussion is calling into question what I've described cultural compensation, which is the tendency of cultural institutions to produce a wave of enthusiasm and appreciation for aspects of Black culture in the wake of moments of Black crisis and injustice. And this discussion wants to explore how the celebration of culture can respond to the racism we've seen, not just in the last 3 weeks, but the long history and legacy of racial injustice around the world. Excuse me. So we will be looking at a range of different examples from media, the arts, film, music, the gallery, and thinking about the responses we've seen in the last few days to what we've now called structural racism, be that a commitment to having more diverse programming, as we've seen with the BBC, a commitment to producing diversity boards and organizations and committees within BAFTA, or a commitment to ensuring that we are seeing a much more greater appreciation of Black culture. However, there's always a danger that the appreciation of culture is temporary. And what happens beyond this moment of heightened consciousness and awareness of Black Lives Matter? Will we be still talking about the celebration of Black culture in a few weeks' time, next year? Can we sustain a conversation about racial injustice through the use of culture? That's what we are hoping this convergence will discuss. And to do so, I want to introduce a wonderful panel of experts who will be joining me in a discussion around these key themes over the next hour. Firstly, we have Bidisha, who is a TV and radio broadcaster, journalist and filmmaker. She specializes in international human rights, social justice, gender, the arts, and offers political analysis, arts critique, and culture diplomacy that tries to work through these intersections together. Her most recent book, Asylum and Exile, Hidden Voices of London, is based on her outreach work in UK prisons, refugee charities, and detention centres. And her most recent film, Impossible Poison, received its London premiere in March 2018. We also have Lanre Bakare, who is the Guardian's arts and culture correspondent. He recently edited the special G2 issue covering race in the UK, and has previously worked in New York and Los Angeles for the Guardian US, and was awarded the Scott Trust bursary recently. And finally, we have Francesca Sobande, who is a lecturer in digital media studies at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. She's the co-author of To Exist is to Resist, Black Feminism in Europe, and is the author of Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, which will be published by Palgrave Macmillan this autumn. So this discussion will last for an hour, followed by a 15-minute response of questions from the audience. I've asked each panelist to prepare a 3 to 5 minute provocation, which will discuss their perspective on the last few weeks, the role of culture in determining how I've been thinking around race and racial equality, but equally, how they feel those forms of media and culture can respond to racism beyond this critical conjuncture. That will be followed by a number of questions within the panel, And then of course, we'll open out to audience questions as well. So firstly, we'll begin with Bidisha.
Hi, Clive, thanks. When you were talking, I realized that we first met exactly 2 years ago, talking about all of this stuff in the context of British film. And that the discussion we had then is probably not going to be markedly different from the one that we're going to have now, or the kinds of questions that the audience is going to bring up right now. And actually, I've been really frustrated, both as a journalist and as someone who sits on boards of arts organizations for the last 3 weeks, because all I'm seeing is a kind of whitewashing around race. I got an email this morning saying, why haven't we, I won't mention who these organizations are because it's systemic, but saying, why haven't we put out a statement about Black Lives Matter yet? And I wrote back saying, has anyone asked for us to give a statement about it? Does anyone care what this books organization cares about what we think about it? And what's this statement going to say that you can't get an algorithm to write in the first place, when the truth of this organization is that, just like everything between the 17th century and the 19th century, it made its money and developed its endowment through slavery and colonization. But that's the one thing that they can't say. So the statement's going to say that obviously racist killings are bad, and that not racist, not killings are good. And that's going to be it for something that nobody is waiting for at all. Meanwhile, in the organization, there's about 3 non-white people, and that whenever something racist actually comes up, number one, it's never as explicit as a racist murder. And number two, whenever you try to bring it up, it doesn't work, because you have to explain something for about 15 hours to get to the beginning point of getting someone to understand, which they don't want to anyway. So actually, I'm incredibly frustrated, and I'm seeing that the entire discussion has sort of moved sideways or backwards. So it seems like people are okay talking about events 200 years ago, but if you sort of try to talk about active, ongoing racism day by day, it just encounters all the resistance that we've all been writing and talking about all the way through. So I'm very, very skeptical about whether this or anything else is any kind of watershed moment, or if what's going to happen is just the cultural version of what fashion brands are doing, which is to employ the equivalent of an advertising agency to put out a statement that is sort of unimpeachable as a statement, while carrying on the way they've always done. I'm incredibly cynical and not really very optimistic about the way things are going culturally. I mean, major cultural institutions have weathered far bigger things than this, and then come through with all of their power structures completely intact. So I'm watching it, but I really agree with what Reniero Lodge said in The Guardian a couple of days ago, that she regards this conversation as a kind of a power game in itself, and that she's very wary about getting involved. And that's where I'm at, really. But I hope I'm at the more pessimistic end of where people are at.
Thank you, that's fantastic. Lanre?
Yeah, I think I'm not too far away from where Bidisha is, sadly. I feel like I've been trapped in this kind of weird Groundhog Day for a while. I think most of us have, with what's going on with the pandemic. But then also when the events with George Floyd happened, I was in America in 2014. I moved there in September. So America was dealing with the Michael Brown situation, what happened there, where he was killed by Darren Wilson, and then you had this kind of incredible run of, horrific run of Black unarmed men being killed and women being killed by the police. Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, Sandra Bland, and on. There's many more. And I remember being in America at that time, and I remember vividly going home from the office and thinking, right, I'm going to put on the TV and see what people are talking about. This was after the Eric Garner non-indictment. And I put on Fox News, and it was just like, wow, just people justifying the fact that this man had been killed. And I saw the reaction to that, and people were out on the street and people were protesting. And I was talking to people back home, and everybody was like, I can't believe this happened in America. It's completely crazy. Like, be careful out there. And I feel as if we're in a similar situation again here. We've seen the same thing play out almost, about this spate of deaths and then big protests. And it does feel different this time because we've seen many, many people all over the world come out. We've had, however many consecutive days of protests. But then the reaction from the media, which I'm obviously a part of, has just been, it's been so kind of piecemeal and poor, and we've already moved on. The moment has already completely passed. I think the moment when it changed was we had the far right protests the other week, and then that picture of the black man carrying the white guy out, and then that was it. All right, we're finished now. Like, racism's kind of not completely fixed, but we've got to the end of this little bit, and we don't really have to talk about this anymore. We can talk about statues and blackface, but let's not talk about kind of systemic racism because it's a bit tough and we don't really get it. And is it really even our problem? So I think for me and my work, I'm just trying to kind of figure out ways that we can keep that conversation going on a regular basis. There are loads of things we can do. We tried to do it a little bit with the G2 race special, which was kind of taking a real look at race in the UK. Not making it an American story, but what's going on in this country, because people are frustrated, they're furious. There's a whole generation of people who grew up probably reading Rennie's book and understanding, where the bodies are buried, and understanding that there are these big systemic problems of being articulate and able to talk about them. So in one way I'm hopeful, because that generation of people, I was at one of the protests and there was so many people out there and they are not going to accept it. They want to change and push that conversation forward. Whether or not they're going to be able to do that is a completely different argument. But yeah, I'm kind of hopeful, but then also a little bit like Bidisha. So yeah.
Thank you. Francesca?
Yeah, I'll start with what encourages me before getting real about, I guess, how cynical I am with regards to what extent certain organisations can actually back up the statements that they're putting out. So I think there are many different examples of grassroots and collective organising and activism that involves the creation and sharing of media, arts and culture as part of the dissemination of really important resources and information. And that's really vital, and it's something that long predates 2020. And I think sometimes what we see is organisations acting as though they weren't aware of the fact that people have been on the ground doing this work for a long time, and they act as though they weren't actually perhaps actively obstructing that sort of work in this, what is sometimes flippantly referred to, this current so-called moment. So I think I see really great examples of community organising and the creation of arts at a time of intense pain, at a time when people are systemically oppressed in ways that are incredibly heightened. But I think what really worries me is that the people doing that work, they aren't a part of the organisations that are sort of rushing to put out statements, often as a way to platform themselves and ultimately try to protect what might be perceived as being their corporate reputation. So I think we're seeing many examples of what might be viewed as the commodification of not only blackness and black people, but specifically black social justice activism. And sometimes we might hear this term woke washing has been used, and that's something I've looked into a bit as part of my own work, whereby organisations for many years have been trying to sort of present themselves as being aligned with certain social justice activist causes. And right now we're seeing this real increase in the number of brands that for the first time ever are posting statements that use the words Black Lives Matter. But beyond that, are we seeing any substantial changes? And if we do see any so-called sort of moves towards change, how is that actually going to impact Black people? And how is that going to change material conditions? And beyond surface level representation and so-called sort of equality, diversity and inclusion agendas, where is the real meaningful change that organisations often want to present themselves as being behind, but which ultimately falls flat in the form of a tweet or a statement that is posted one day and deleted the next?
Thank you, Francesca. Wow, that is a lot for us to really get into. And for myself, having thought about this for the last 3 weeks, one thing I've noticed that cuts across everything that all three of you said is the emergence of the term structural racism into the popular agenda in quite unprecedented ways. And in many ways, the skepticism that you've all suggested is needed here is born from the rapid response from questions of diversity, which is what we're using to describe racial inequality just 3 weeks ago, to now the recognition that structural racism exists within our cultural institutions. And there is something in that rapid response from diversity, structural racism within a 3-week period that, for me and for many people, promotes a particular skepticism about how our public institutions, our cultural institutions, our media institutions have done that critical work to understand and rethink racism and arrive at the point where we're now describing these things as structural. So, Bidisha, I want to ask you particularly, given that your work crosses across journalism and publishing and film, what do you think that cultural institutions should be doing right now?
Oh, wow, that's a really good one. I'm a big fan of, I mean, I like uncomfortable conversations, and the thing that I've seen definitely work is what I call listening sessions, which is where you line up the head of department or the, you know, like the person, and you testify in front of them, and in return for you being given the space to basically list all the microaggressions you've ever experienced at the organization, you let the other person off the hook by saying they don't need to respond in the moment. So it cuts out their defensiveness, and you just say to them, okay, look, this is going to be really embarrassing and uncomfortable. You don't have to answer back, but you do have to stay in the room and shut up and listen for the 2 hours that we're going to do this. And as awful as it is, I have seen that work. So there's a sort of drip, drip, drip feed effect of someone actually just hearing testimonies of what it's actually just like to work in every organization. It's a bit like the Me Too movement. You know, these aren't legalistic movements. Whenever people in arts organizations have been sacked, like in America, there have been lots of stepping downs at the tops of magazines, but I think those were the people who were ready to leave anyway. So I don't believe or trust any of those resignations or stepping downs. But listening circles really work. And that's one practical thing that I can suggest, but people have to be willing to do that. And what I've seen again and again is that they say they're willing, so there's a commitment to doing it. And then inevitably the people stay away in droves, or when the moment's gone, they repeatedly delay, and then somehow by magic, the thing never happens because it's been postponed 7 times, and then 40% of people don't go. So I'm really at a loss to say what should be done, but I think it has to begin just with testimonials, because the other stuff doesn't work. You know, trying to go through grievance procedures and tribunals clearly, obviously doesn't work. I'm very cynical about us all kind of constantly writing op-eds about it, because all that does for us, particularly me and Lanre as journalists, is that then becomes your beat. And I really always resisted trying to be that person that's talking about race all the time, because they honestly can't tell us apart. And if it's not me, it's him. And if it's not him, it's going to be someone else who's on the list. So it has to be done in a communal, off the record, speech-based way.
I'm interested in your use of both journalism and the race debate, because we've seen a quite unprecedented rush of spokespersons who have been parachuted into the desks at Newsnight or Good Morning Britain or BBC News or Channel 4 News to be that person who articulates the nation's mood. And it's a particularly new format of the race debate that becomes a spectacle. It often becomes a way of someone displaying black anger or black grief, but doesn't really engage with the key questions around racial inequality. And Lanre, to bring you in as a journalist as well, how have you read the last 3 weeks in terms of what I would call the psychic wound and pressure and responsibility of the black public figure to now be the black spokesperson within these race debates? Are there ever really debates or just spectacles for people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know kind of how new they are actually, because I was thinking, just as you were speaking then, I was thinking of the episode of Brass Eye where Dark as How is on it. I don't know if you remember that. But he comes on and Chris Morris is basically lampooning that exact thing, and he's saying to him, it comes up and like the little caption at the bottom of the screen goes, Mr. Darkest House, speaker for every black person in the UK. And he starts calling someone else's name, and it's quite uncomfortable. It probably goes a little bit too, like it's a bit kind of at Darkest's expense, but so that was back in the 90s. And I think like George the Poet, when he was on Newsnight, I thought he did incredibly well, but there was an amazing moment where Emily Maitlis, I think he just explained, he just talked about the death of Christopher Alder in police custody in 1998, which is a really shocking case. I think worse, that was in Hull. And I think that was worse than George Floyd, in my opinion. Like he was picked up outside a nightclub, something happened to him in a police van, he was left on the floor of a police station, he was dying basically, the officers did nothing to help him, they were making monkey noises, it was all caught on video. And he brought this up, and then as an example of like the fact that it happens here as well. And Emily Maitlis just went, yeah, well, that's just one example. So, and just moved on completely. Obviously, hadn't ever heard of the case, wasn't shocked by it. And it was just like, what are these debates? It's just George the Poet in this case, but it could have been Rennie or any one of us brought in to try and articulate, yeah, the black kind of point of view. And often a lot of racism is thrown at them, and they're expected to kind of just sit there and kind of deal with it, stay completely calm and articulate, or you can go the other route and kick off, in which case is a kind of performative blackness where you're enraged, and people like to see that, you know. When I've written pieces where I've been angry, it's been clear, there's a kind of strange reaction that you get, and people seem to really, they'll email you and be like, yeah, see, you were really angry there, like, I get that, yeah. And they seem to get that, but when you're a bit more articulate and calm, you come from a different angle, people seem to struggle with it a little bit. So yeah, it goes to that first thing, it's just like, it just feels very repetitious, like you know what the playbook is. And I think that's why Rennie, I've not talked to her about it, but I'm pretty sure that's why, she said it in the interview, that's why she stayed away from it. You won't see her go on Newsnight or Piers Morgan and be shouted at and goaded like Dizzy Rascal was the other morning. It was completely ridiculous. So yeah, I think the media knows what the playbook is, and they kind of feel like they're kind of done with Black Lives Matter now. They've had the debate, like we've had Dizzy Rascal, we've had George the Poet, like let's move on to whatever it is, John Bolton's book or something like that. So yeah, I'm sounding really cynical, but you've seen the play so many times, and it's so repetitious. And yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen a debate about a race on British TV which has been satisfactory, genuinely, my whole life.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that people are now withdrawing their labour from the mainstream. You mentioned Rennie. I know Afro Hirsch has spoke quite vocally about her displeasure at constantly being the one person who has to come on Sky News or come to the BBC and defend an anti-racist position, and the kind of trauma that one needs to experience from that. But equally, we are now seeing there needs to be a responsibility often for people of colour to come there and defend an anti-racist position that wouldn't have actually taken place without those people there. And to draw on your work, Francesca, do you think this is a consequence of social media and what you described as the commodification of black protest, and often the ability of social media to create black spokespeople who are then essentially preyed upon by the media to be placed in those situations as the anointed black spokesperson?
Yeah, so I think it's tricky. What I often say is with social media and digital spaces, there are many opportunities to facilitate important activism and facilitate resistance, but there are so many risks that come along with that. And I think what we're seeing right now is sometimes referred to as this new emergence of activism, or this new emergence of creativity and responses to this political and current moment. But I think it's more so about visibility and also, more specifically, I'd say surveillance. So I think there definitely is very clearly examples of organisations within the media, arts and culture, creative industries, essentially observing what has been happening online within certain places, within certain grassroots organisations, and trying to position themselves in proximity in a way that will ultimately be self-serving to the organisation. So I think something that is something I constantly think about, and something that right now feels very important to be critically considering, is to what extent is it possible to use social media and digital spaces as part of countercultural organising, anti-racist organising, specifically Black activist organising, in ways that are going to be more generative than they are going to cause harm to those who are at the root of that organising. And I think quite often we hear about the importance of digital spaces and the online, and with regards to the sort of organising that we've been speaking about and seeing about. But I think it's really, really necessary that we don't forget about what's occurring elsewhere. And again, to keep coming back, as we seem to be doing as part of this conversation, to the legacy of organising, and the fact that what we're seeing right now might be presented as new in a way that can absolve institutions and individuals of any responsibility or of any need to actually enact the change they claim they want to be about. And yeah, I think the digital, I'll keep going round in circles in some ways about it. It presents a lot of opportunities to expose white supremacy, to call it out, but we also know that within various digital spaces, whether it's YouTube and whether it's other parts of online content sharing sites, white supremacy is harvested, and far-right radicalism occurs at a rapid rate. So maybe a question, or where I'll end my thoughts on this, is to what extent can the digital really provide us with the tools and the environment and the connections that are necessary to move forward with anti-racist organising and Black activist organising, when we know that surveillance is always going to be rife?
Really, really interesting points about digital, and I think I agree with you that it's very, very hard to have complete faith in the digital because it's so democratized and open to be manipulated by a various number of actors. And in hearing us speak quite openly, which I can imagine must be quite difficult for all of us and many people listening, given the events of the last 3 or 4 weeks, I can't help but thinking that we're in a moment now that is a third phase of how the mainstream tries to manage racism and difference. So I'm thinking of that moment after Stephen Lawrence in 1999 and the Ferguson report, and what was the birth of what we now understand to be diversity that was pursued in cultural institutions, and we're living with a legacy still. Before then, we had the politics of multiculturalism, which we lived with in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And is it now we're coming into this new phase, which is structural racism? There's the term that we use to describe what was previously race relations, which was previously diversity, as a way that cultural institutions try to manage difference. Bidisha, what do you think? Are we in this new moment where we're seeing an unprecedented uprising? Can we have any faith in the ability of institutions to claim or insist that they recognize that those structures are racist now?
I don't think you'll ever get a full admission of what the deal really is. And actually, you were talking about how this might be a difficult conversation. For me, it's really liberating because everyone's in the club. So you don't have to do the 40% of explaining that happens at the beginning of every conversation. I mean, it's actually a real relief, because usually when you're talking about these things in an arts or cultural organization, you have to censor yourself to such a degree that by the time you all agree on what your version of racist is, it's such a boiled down version that no one ever gets anywhere. I think that one thing that might help is that we're in an age of protest and a kind of anti-capitalist questioning anyway. So everyone is looking at major power structures, whether they're at universities or they're in the media or they're in finance and banking, and saying, well, why does this look the way it does, when clearly, obviously, this isn't working for anyone. Clearly, this is exploitative and unequal. Clearly, you've got a whole generation of people who are 21 who are going to come out of university. They're already in debt. They're not likely to be able to get any job in any area. And that's subject to race and gender and class on top of all of the other stuff. So I don't think this is a bad moment to have that conversation. And I'm thinking now, particularly listening to Francesca, that the answer is going to be totally grassroots. It's going to be completely a civil rights movement-led change, rather than people at Tate or the National Gallery or the National Theatre having lots of roundtables about how they can hire one more person that's not white to do their job, to do some job that they've just invented for the next 4 years. I think that the bourgeois structures are the ones which are the absolute hardest to change. Why? Because the people in them are the absolute worst, which is the liberals, because they think they already understand it, so they're not willing to change. And the worst thing that's happened in the last 3 weeks is all the emails you get from people who are like, have never spoken to you before in your life, and they come up to you with really big eyes going, isn't it awful? And those are the people you'll never, you know, how do you turn around and say to exactly those people, look, what you said is super patronizing and blah, 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 because they can't hear it. So I think that change will come either aggressively top down, so through kind of the forcible changing of structures, or aggressively bottom up, but it won't happen at the level of pained lunches and roundtable discussions and hiring 1 or 2 more people. And I'm also aware that the anti-racism discussion has also become extremely class-based. So whenever you go to a big organization and say, what are you doing? They basically tell you they've got lots of internships for poor people who are BAME, because that's what they think. They think that we don't go to university. They think that we've all been to crap schools. They think that we don't know how to get into these organizations, when that's not the problem. The problem is that they're exclusionary and racist and othering.
Lanre, just building upon Bidisha's thoughts, I'm thinking about the visual. I'm thinking about some of the work you've done more recently on what I call the rapid response and the cultural compensation to the events of the last 3 weeks. In particular, the pulling back and withdrawal of films and TV shows that are now deemed to be racist or racially insensitive, to use a term, that previously weren't considered in those terms 3 weeks ago. Of course, I'm thinking of Little Britain, I'm thinking of Gone with the Wind, I'm thinking of other shows that have been kind of pulled both in the US and the UK. How do you read that phenomenon of the withdrawal of TV shows and films that are now deemed to be racially offensive? Should we be kind of preserving these as artifacts of how racist institutions were up until 3 weeks ago, or should these be taken down as being offensive?
Yeah, I think the first piece I wrote for The Guardian as the arts and culture correspondent, this is going back to April last year, was about whether Disney Plus, which launched in November, I think, in the UK, was going to have Song of the South on it, which is an old Disney film. It launched, I think it was out in the 1940s, did huge box office, was very popular at the time, but was really controversial because it basically presented life on a southern plantation as this like idyllic time where like there was a character called Uncle Remus in it. Like, it was really not okay. And Disney was deciding whether or not to put it on its streaming service that was launching. It decided to not put it on. And it was also debating at the time whether to include a scene in Dumbo, which it's quite famous. There's some crows, these black crows who were dancing, and it's seen as a racist caricature. So that was the first piece I wrote. So it's been going on for a little while. And some of the voices in that at the time were saying, I spoke to Ashley Clark, who's a programmer at BAM in Brooklyn, which is a fantastic institution, and he was saying, look, if you present these things in the context and you give them context and you talk about them, even if they are incredibly offensive, they should probably be there. And I'm kind of more on that side of the debate where we shouldn't be trying to bury them. Because also, like, some of these movies are incredibly cynical, like Netflix taking the 3rd series of The Mighty Boosh off its service. I mean, that's nothing. That's easy. You can do it in like 2 seconds. No one's even watching it. And then it gets you press. I mean, we did that story, so maybe I'm kind of part of the problem. And it was interesting, the day that happened, I interviewed the comedian Eric Andre, who is a mixed race comedian from America. He has his own show on Adult Swim, and he's just got a Netflix special. And we were talking about it, and he was like, he'd just been out protesting in LA, and he was like, nobody out in the street in LA cares about a peripheral character in The Mighty Boosh, you know, whether or not that is offensive or not. So personally, from my point of view, I think it's really cynical for these companies to remove them. I think it's, in some ways, the debate's been healthy. Not a lot of it, but a little bit, maybe 10% of it. I think the debate around Bo Selector was important because Trisha Goddard got to come out and say, look, you've ruined my career by doing this. It was, you know, the impact that can have on someone. I mean, when you look back at that portrayal, it was completely racist. And like Lee Francis crying or whatever, like, I'm not really bothered about that, but Trisha Goddard getting to have that kind of public reckoning was good. But then when you get into like Little Britain and Mighty Boosh and League of Gentlemen, I don't know. Personally, I feel like these things, because they can stay on the streaming platform as long as they're presented in context and there's some warning there for people who are going into it. Because it's important that we know that 10 years ago, this stuff was on British TV and people were laughing their asses off about it. And now all of a sudden everyone's up in arms about it. It's really important because it shows like how people talk about the progress we've made in this country. But has it really come that far? You know, like Stuart Hall was talking about this stuff in the 70s, you know, and these programs were still getting commissioned. And I think that's part of the problem. And you know better than anyone, Clive, like, and Bidisha, you'll know, and so Francesca knows, like, when you get to the upper echelons of the British TV industry and film industry, it's just incredibly white, and they don't see these things as problems. And now all of a sudden they're running around pulling off their services because it suits their agenda. It's pretty transparent and not that convincing.
I mean, Francesca, even just thinking about the point that Lanre is making around institutions, I'm thinking about the BBC and their commitment this week to invest £100 million in diverse content over the next 3 years. I mean, how do you read that as, again, what I describe as a cultural compensation that's very much in response to this moment we're in now? Is it simply about making sure there are more TV shows with some semblance of blackness? Is it about making sure that the directors and those in the boardrooms are of colour? Or, to quote the work of Unmixed Saha, have a lack of faith in the ability of the one black person in the boardroom to actually stimulate change because he's still working within a very, very white institution? What kind of faith and hope can we put in those kind of cultural compensations?
Yeah, so I think this term, I think it was diverse content was what you said, and I guess just the language surrounding equality, diversity and inclusion, I think it's weaponized in a lot of different ways, and it's strategically used to ambiguously allude to sort of difference without naming things like, you know, power, white supremacy, anti-blackness, and the specific forms of oppression that black people face. So it's probably an unsurprising response, but this notion of diverse content and efforts to ensure that diverse content is included, I don't really have a very strong position in a way in response to that as a concept, because I think it's so vague that it only seems to serve an institution in terms of implying they're going to do something that's going to address these issues without, again, naming what those issues are and perhaps being frank about how, as an organisation, they have been a part of that problem. So I think, you know, we've spoken quite a bit about structural racism, and we've spoken about the different ways that terms have evolved over the decades and been sort of the moment or in trend. And I think one of the things that I've really noticed, and again is perhaps unsurprising, is that many of the statements that we've seen made by organisations and some of the moves that they say they're going to be implementing over the coming months or years, very rarely do we see words such as anti-black racism appear, and very rarely do we see them naming exactly what the problem is. And more often than not, we're going to see these statements cloaked in corporate communication language that is there to appease and there to distract from the reality of institutional racism, structural racism, and in particular anti-black violence.
Goodness. I mean, you've struck on a really important point here, which is the discord between these institutions and their public responses to the last 3 weeks and using the language of structural racism. But what we see that the ideas they're purporting to be approaching are still cloaked in the idea of diversity. And is it because, Bidisha, we haven't developed in this country a real praxis of anti-racism within institutions, because we've never really fully accepted anti-racism or racism as a phenomenon within society? So our natural language becomes diversity, becomes diverse content. It can't grapple with the idea at a policy level of how we produce anti-racism within institutions. Is that what the distance is here?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, in that there's this classic really English thing of instead of wanting things to be different, to want them to be nice. So it's much easier to say things are diverse, like a fabulous potpourri and everyone's getting along, than to say something's wrong and let's fix it and it's going to be painful. I also think England has a very, two things. First, England has a very odd relationship with America. So We absorb huge amounts of American cultural output, and at the same time we think that they're like the really big shit redneck version of England, as if we're in some kind of relationship with them, which we're not really. So it's easy. So something really weird and Freudian happens, whereby all of the most violent impulses are somehow imputed to the big brother, which is America. So we can then point at America and say, well, you know, we're bad and it's not nice, but in America it's really, really bad and it's really, really real. Whereas over here it's different because basically we're English and that's much better. And the second thing is just a complete cultural amnesia about colonization and slavery, and that's gone on for decades and decades. At no point in any textbook, including up to university level, will there be anything about colonization and slavery. So there are generations of Britons who genuinely, truly, absolutely don't know anything about it whatsoever. And that includes prime ministers and anyone who went to Eton and anyone who did PPE at Oxford and then went into the cabinet. And it's really, really convenient to then plead ignorance if you are genuinely ignorant. And then when you learn, obviously it's painful and confronting and embarrassing. And so you don't do the work. And I think that's a real kind of, it's a really clever do-over. I mean, I think it's absolutely deliberate and really pernicious. And it's all glossed over with this sort of British, well, you know, don't make things awkward. You got here, didn't you? So just shut up and let's all just be nice to each other because that's in the past. And that's really clever. And it's also exactly what, you know, abusive perpetrators in relationships do, which is to say, you know, to not take responsibility for what happened and to pretend that every day is like year zero and let's just move on and can't we all just have a lovely conversation together. It's completely deliberate and intentional. And I'm glad that what's happening now is forcing a reckoning. And also, you know, the idea of pulling down statues, which people were so opposed to. I like the symbolism of that in the sense that people did pull down statues and the world didn't cave in. So now we have to talk about it.
Interesting you mentioned statues and how we discuss them in public. Lanre, do you think that the public discussion around bringing down statues and monoliths is satisfactory for an anti-racist agenda? Do we take these statues down from the public and place them in galleries as an artifact of how Britain was and our role in slavery and colonialism? Or do we leave them at the bottom of a river? Where do we place these?
I mean, I think on the Colston statue, we had a debate at work the other day, and David Olusoga joined in, and he was talking about the statue being rolled into the river, and he said it was the perfect place for it because from that point in Bristol was where some of the slave ships would actually launch from. And I'm a big Drexciya fan. They're a kind of Detroit techno group, and they've done a lot of work about, like, a lot of their themes were around the Black Atlantis, which is this idea of, like, during the Middle Passage, when slaves were thrown, or enslaved people were thrown overboard, they would create their own kind of world under the water. And I felt like with the Colston statue, the perfect place for it is in that harbour. Like, just keep it there. Like, maybe people can go and dive and hang around there and, like, check it out and see what they think. But I mean, there was something really poignant and poetic and beautiful about that moment. Obviously, it's been pulled out now, and it's probably going to end up in some sort of museum. And I think, you know, the people who did that, they created history. Like, it was a genuinely huge moment in this country. It's kind of been played out into a, you know, it became this kind of debate quickly about Churchill and whether you know, what we're going to do next, what we're going to pull down next. You know, it became like this thing of us and them, and they're going to take away our statues. Then it got kind of parlayed into a political thing of, like, a Labour behind this. Like, if they moved on from Corbyn, is Keir Starmer going to stand with these statues, which is kind of bananas. So yeah, I think, do they belong in museums? I think in the case of Colston, maybe, because he's such a kind of horrific, egregious example that, you know, people need to know who he was. And I think one of the great things about the last couple of weeks is that people have gone off and Googled and found out about Colston. They've figured out, oh, that's why Massive Attack would never play at Colston Hall, because this guy, you know, traded in thousands of enslaved people and, you know, ruined the lives of thousands. And then we celebrated for it 200 years after he died. You know, the whole thing really lifted the lid on where we were as a country in the kind of 1890s when that statue was erected and what we were trying to do at that time. and the way we're trying to kind of, even at that point, rewrite our history and kind of show ourselves as this kind of strange, benevolent colonial power, even though we absolutely, you know, we're the worst people going. So yeah, I think it's a tough one, because the debate, it kind of just was used by, I think, a lot of elements of the right-wing press and some other elements of the press as well, to kind of move the debate into this area where it became us and them, and it was a comfortable conversation. They know how that one plays out. You know, it's a simple one. Is it like, do we defend our history, or should we chuck it in the river? Which is a kind of false debate. So yeah, I kind of feel as if, you know, I cheered when it went in the river, but then I kind of worried as to what that was going to be turned into. I interviewed Angela Davis like the day after that, and you know, she said, you know, it was a great moment, but kind of pointed to what Francesca was saying before, it's going to be grassroots organising that gets it done, and that was quite sobering, because I was kind of jumping up and down and cheering, and then I was like, oh, actually, yeah, maybe I want to think about, you know, supporting my local group rather than just getting excited because the statues in the river.
I want to go to some questions from audience and participants. And the first one is, how effective is the withdrawal of Black Labour in order to protest against institutional racism? Francesca?
So my first thoughts are I guess it depends on what we're sort of measuring in terms of identifying how effective it is. But what I would say is, I think at times the withdrawal of Black labour is necessary with regards to the survival of Black people. So beyond thinking about, does the withdrawal of Black labour expose a situation so much so that we see institutional change, I think that definitely that can result in that in some way. But I guess at a different level, but one that is just as important, thinking about people on a personal level. If somebody is in a situation that is so inherently harmful to them and their health, their well-being, their safety, then the withdrawal of Black labour is sometimes necessary in terms of them focusing on their survival. So yeah, I think the withdrawal of Black labour is something that I think more often than not needs to happen in order for situations to change. But what is really awful is quite often that means somebody perhaps stepping away from a situation to protect their health, to protect their well-being, but also doing so in a way that might impact them negatively financially and exacerbate the structural inequalities and material conditions that they're already navigating.
Bidisha?
I completely and absolutely agree with all of that, but I also think that this is it's something that Francesca and Lanre were both saying a bit earlier on, that at times like this we're just all called upon to do yet more labour, you know, starting from year zero and then explaining exactly every tiny little facet of racism and microaggressions and systematic racism and all the rest of it, that then has to be boiled down into either a 4-minute TV or radio slot that gets us nowhere. I mean, it's a form of institutional gaslighting, because whenever we're called upon to discuss racism, 9 times out of 10, all it does is replicate our experience of racism. All it does is leave us with the bad taste in our mouths that we then think about for the next 2 weeks about how we couldn't convey the point we were trying to make, or people didn't get it. All it does is bring on more abuse and more threats and more racism from strangers online. And I absolutely think it's very, very powerful to just simply refuse to do any of that. And whenever particularly in the last 3 weeks, I've been contacted by organizations saying, how can we learn? I said, well, I always say that's completely wonderful. Good luck on your learning journey. And it's so telling how incredibly affronted people are when you say that, when you simply refuse to act like basically their servant or secretary or subordinate or employee when you're not. It just points up the sheer amount of entitlement encoded in the demand that we somehow explain it or point them in the right direction.
Goodness, mate. Lanre, any comments on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think if institutions want to take, deal with this moment or this thing that we're living through seriously. I think they need to put resources behind it rather than just, as Bidisha said, kind of relying on people to come in and tell them what to do just because they're black. You know, I've definitely had that in my career very recently, and it's incredibly frustrating, especially when, you know, you could make changes within an institution. For example, introducing a race editor whose job it is just to think about these issues and to commission and to be completely on top of every new bit of research, and speaking to people like Francesca and you, Clive, and also Bidisha, to find out what, you know, where we're going next with this, and really keep, you know, news organisations on the cutting edge. Now, that'd be an amazing kind of intervention, but instead there's this kind of expectancy that you, me, and other black minority ethnic staff will just have the answers and be able to do that for them, and that kind of work, which is just extra work, you know, on top of your job. You know, my job's arts and culture correspondent. I'm not a race correspondent. I don't get paid for that. But, you know, often, you know, sometimes in my career, I've had to step in and stop things going live, which just have been, you know, not where they should be in terms of race, and that's just an incredible kind of burden that you have, and it takes a toll on you personally. And yeah, like Bidisha said, it shows no respect for you, for who you are and the kind of things that you bring to the table.
Collecting practices and the funding of museums is notoriously white. What can be done? Francesca?
So, sorry, was that to do with collecting practices and curatorial practices within museums?
Yeah, and funding as well of museums.
And funding as well, yeah. So I think this maybe picks up on something that I think Bidisha said earlier on, and it's more just about the arts, media and cultural sector or industry in general. But I think with regards to changing who works in these institutions and who is at the root of creating these structures and trying to dismantle them and create them again from the start, right from the bottom, I think a real problem is that there's always this focus on, as has been said, internships and training opportunities and entry-level guidance is what is sometimes referred to as, for people from what is often referred to as underrepresented demographics and groups, right? And I think what's really worrying is we all know people who, they don't lack the skills, they don't lack the leadership training, they don't lack the capacity to do the work that they want to do and would probably do not only very well, but often better than those who are already in positions. And I think with regards to, say, curatorial practices and museums and how they work right now, I think the system is so fundamentally flawed and built on colonialist, racist, anti-black foundations in so many cases, that this focus on helping people enter an environment that's often going to be counter to their well-being is useless. And the conversation, or not conversation, because we've spoken about the limitations of panels and roundtable discussions, but the action that needs to take place is a real reckoning with the landscape as it is, and thinking, how can things be done entirely differently? How can this structure be dismantled? And how can we push against this narrative that has so often been at the forefront, whereby Black people, people of colour, queer people, people who exist at the intersections of all these different groups are referred to as though they are lacking the ability to take on the very work they want to do.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I feel ambivalent, because the thing is, I love institutions like, for example, the Tate galleries. I treat it like my local. My dream would be to be featured in there, to have one of my films screened in there. And I absolutely think that if they didn't have their money taken from BP or whoever, who else would it be? It would be like a Jordanian dictator or a Chinese firm that had made money through sending children down mines to get stuff for our mobile phones. That once you get to that elite level, I do actually think that all of the money is probably bent in some way or another. And it's very, very hard to find that amount of funding that is completely clean and ethical. So if you want to be part of those worlds, whatever color you are, it involves swallowing down the reality of huge amounts of inequality behind the scenes. And I think that's a given. It's also true in film. It's also true in theatre. That just to put on that level of cultural output, which is really mainstream and really acclaimed, it's watched by lots of people, it's going to be funded by someone or something which is so unethical, it's really hard to deal with. And that their version of internationalism involves, you know, Tokyo and Berlin and maybe a few other countries which are in at the moment, but that's not the same as it being multicolored. That's what I notice hugely about particularly art and film, that it's often multicultural, it's often multilingual, but it's not multicolored, and it's not multi-class at all. Having said that, what bothers me is that I don't think that there should be a second tier of sort of ghettoized, underfunded DIY shit stuff for all the other people, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I've been around these institutions too long to think that they're going to change anytime soon. And I also think that for emergent artists, they know that the only way to survive and succeed is to play the game and to speak on the race and diversity panels, while secretly doing that thing that you do, which is that you know that your presence is tokenized and it's not going to go anywhere.
Wow, goodness. Lanre, any contributions?
You're dropping truth bombs there. I think, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I suppose, as you were speaking then, you talk about funding. I think there is an alternative. I mean, look at France and Germany. Like, you can do it through the public purse if you want. But ideologically, in this country, we've completely moved away from that. I remember, I think I spoke to you, Clive, and you mentioned a book by Chris Smith when he became culture secretary, and he like released it as all his speeches when he first came in. I went back and read that because I'm a geek or whatever. And, you know, Labour then, they're just constantly talking about how the arts needs to get in bed with business and this is how we do it. And I think you still see that manifest with, like, say, Tristan Hunt, when he's interviewed about funding at the V&A and, like, giving back Sackler money. He's like, no, why would I do that? You know, it just doesn't get it. Like, it doesn't seem to register at all, because he's doing what he's been told to do. This is how we make the arts work. This is how it becomes a success story, is by getting this corporate funding, regardless of where it comes from. I mean, I think funding's a tough one because, like Bidisha said, you know, the thing with capitalism is someone's going to get screwed over at some point if you made a lot of money. I just think sometimes in the UK we let some really kind of egregious things go, where money has come from, like, the arms trade, you know, the Sackler money. It's a pretty dark and murky world. So yeah, when you're involved in that, I mean, I've seen some of the work that White Pew do, where they've just been talking about, you know, what it's like to work in these institutions, and it just sounds kind of hellish. And I know working in the media, sometimes a lot of the time you've got to kind of hold your nose and just kind of get on with it and try to do your job as best as you can. And that's the way you stay sane, but that can be incredibly difficult. You know, there can be moments where I've just thought, what is the point of this? What am I doing? I'm just kind of propping up some of these institutions which need to change, and it can really have a deep impact on you as a person. So yeah, I think there's a hell of a long way to go. I think sometimes in this country we act as if, you know, we're so much better than America, we're so much further down the line, but I think in reality we've not even started to have this debate.
Well, it's now 7 p.m, so you have around 50 minutes left. So here is a question that really kind of builds on both that point and Bidisha's points as well. So building from Bidisha's point, museums I've worked in say that application processes are open to everyone and they actively encourage diverse applications, but they tend to attract the same people. There's obviously something inherent in the institutions preventing people from even considering applying. Have you seen any institutions making genuine progress in addressing these issues? Let's start with Bidisha.
That's a really good question. I'm thinking of theatres like the Kiln and the Bush Theatre, who are very, very good about diversity and equality, but the significant difference there is that in both those institutions they have very diverse leadership, and that to me makes all the difference, is having leaders who don't just get it and say they get it, but they're actually literally in the club. Immediately makes a step change throughout the organization. There's just a different flavor, a different language, and they can, because they can really see people for who they are. The question about the types of people who are attracted to, let's say, arts and culture jobs, I actually think that's a given, that whatever the color of the person, and even in lots of ways, whatever their background, certain personality types are attracted to those jobs. So you often get the same kind of person in them. And I actually don't think that's a bad thing. If arty people want to go for arty jobs, then that's how it goes. But there's a whole different thing, because I actually think that when institutions talk about their recruiting practices, I just think that's a complete, total whitewash, because I have never got a job that I've never applied for a job anyway, but I never got a job that I interviewed for ever. 100% of everything I've done in my career is through some kind of backdoor means, or whoever I knew, or someone I met who called me or sent me an email casually. And that is the real key to it. So when institutions talk about how they've changed their policy documents or their application processes, it's total BS. Everyone knows it's about who you know and about casual hiring practices, and that's what keeps people out.
Francesca?
Yeah, I don't think I could confidently say I can think of examples of organisations that are addressing this well, but what I'd just add to the conversation is I think sometimes when organisations start to think about issues to do with racism and to do with who's represented within that particular context, sometimes they don't also address issues to do with class and to do with the fact that even if they want to change their workforce and want to ensure that not everybody who works there is white, they're not always thinking about what it means to, quite often when we're dealing with the creative and culture industry, create a setting where it's people predominantly, if not exclusively, from middle to upper class backgrounds. So I think when organisations are frustrated about the lack of different people applying for roles, and they sometimes feel as though, well, we've advertised this widely, why are we not getting that interest? People do their research when they look at jobs. They get a sense of the organisation, they get a sense of who might work there or who tends to be welcome in that environment. And there are so many exclusionary aspects to creative and cultural organisations, whether it's to do with classism, racism, and so forth. And at the end of the day, it will always fall on the shoulders of the organisation to address that, as opposed to the people who they're saying they want to recruit. And if organisations are failing to attract the attention and interest of the very people they say they want to be a part of that organisation, then again, they need to have a think about the culture they've created and the long-term strategy to address that, rather than worrying about trying to invite people in, or at least pretend to encourage people to approach them when they're going to be walking into an environment that might be very hostile towards who they are.
Lanre?
Yeah, I was just, as you were speaking then, I was just thinking about when I started in journalism and how kind of naive I was about who could be a journalist. I just thought, well, I'm pretty good academically, I'll just do this. Like, I just want to do it, why not? And then, you get into a national newspaper, you look around and you think, whoa, there is literally no one like me here. Not just in terms of what you look like, but how you sound, the way you are, your demeanour. And I think that's kind of in the media where it falls down. Number one, there's kind of like an agnostic approach. Like a lot of institutions just are not bothered about it. They don't care about diversity. They don't think there's a problem. They don't think they need to address it. It's not even on their, way down the agenda in terms of what they want to achieve and kind of sort out. So you're already in a situation where you've got a fairly hostile kind of environment to walk into anyway. And for me, that I'm just trying to think of. I can't think of like. I mean, the Guardian's done a good job with the Scottish bursary. I think Joseph Harker's done amazing work in getting people through the door, and that's been fantastic. But I've kind of looked across at America at times with a bit of kind of jealousy during this period, and seen like the changes that have gone at the New York Times, like the pressure that their journalists were able to put on the publisher about the James Bennett stuff, with the op-ed stuff. I thought that just showed that there is a real kind of like concerted group of people there that are able to make a change. Similarly, the Washington Post, they put a lot of pressure on their publisher. Obviously, they've got Amazon money, so they've been able to create new posts which address race, which is good. It's kind of a win. And then the LA Times, I think they've got this new unionised body, and they were able to, they put out a Black Lives Matter statement, which was about their own failings within the organisation, which I think is exactly what, if you're going to put out a statement, that's what it should be. So yeah, I think it's when you get to this critical mass of having enough journalists in an organisation who are aware of the situation and from a genuinely diverse background, then you start seeing the changes being put through the organisation. But it's never going to be simple. It's never going to be, it's going to be a tough arm wrestle. And I think the people who speak out and put their head above the parapet, they can suffer for that, and they know that professionally. They can suffer, and unfortunately, that's, I think, still the situation we're in terms of journalism across the piece. It's very difficult for people to do that and speak out and have a career.
I'm conscious of time. We have like around 6-7 minutes left, so I'm going to throw out some direct questions that I'm seeing coming through. So Francesca, one for you. Do digital technologies offer a line of flight for Black cultural producers?
I think that I absolutely think, depending on which digital technologies and depending on how they're used and with what intention, they can be a really key part of the creation of content, the sharing of art, collaborative, creative activities led by Black people. So I definitely wouldn't want to suggest otherwise. I think this is the but, the risks that will always exist, as I mentioned earlier on, is depending on which technologies are being used, who governs them, who's behind them, the level of visibility that the Black people involved in that work experience, and more specifically the level of surveillance. I think that it can be really difficult for people to do what they want to creatively as part of collective organising, with the use of these digital technologies and spaces, without it coming at sometimes a very considerable cost.
Bidisha, here's a question. I work within a national institution where staff are now exploring ways to take grassroots style forms of activism within their institutions. And the same applies for other museums. I'm interested to hear from you on this and if they have any advice. So how can institutions take a more grassroots-led approach to activism?
That's really interesting. I wonder who they work for. I think that museums are the crustiest form of cultural repository and the hardest to shift, because they're so entrenched with history and donor and stakeholder relationships that, in fact, the only way you're going to change museums is if you do it in a really aggressively vibrant grassroots, let's just brainstorm everything and throw it onto the table way. The good thing about museums is that you have a ready-made venue. So you have basically a box that you can fill with anything, and you can bring in curators and you can hire curators for different things, and that actually works really well. So it would involve the museum management stepping back massively and opening up their collections and beginning to have conversations with other collections, maybe even, not established museums, but archives and repositories of other cultural artifacts that were not in the traditional museum world, and letting brought in curators who they then have a long-term relationship with to recurate and rehang and to open up each of the venues as a site for discussion. So it's exactly what we were saying about statues, that you can't just have a kind of half dredged up statue sitting in the middle of the floor as an art artifact. You have to have a description of why that's there, why that's important. And luckily you can do all of those things with museums. The warning would be to resist tokenization. So I know that for the next 18 months, what we're going to see is Black curators brought in to do one project, given £700 just to curate a 3-week exhibition, and no one remembers it afterwards at all. It's just a form of box ticking to make the institution look good. But the alternative is that museums can then appoint people on much longer contracts. Curatorial contracts can easily be 5 to 7 years. They have a lot of prestige attached to them. I'm in favor of museums and organizations and institutions. I think we belong there. We're British too. We deserve all of these things as well. They have to be willing to do that, and they have to be willing to put their money behind it, and that's where the resistance is. Arts organizations are really up for all of this stuff as long as no one gets money or power at the end of it. They need to start giving the money and the power over a little bit.
I want to conclude with a question for all of us here, which tries to unify these two moments of change we've experienced over the last 3 weeks, but beyond this as well, which is Black Lives Matter, but also COVID and the lockdown and the impact that will have on the sector. How can we sustain a policy or program where cultural institutions, the media, the arts, the film, the TV, the music, respond in the ways we've been discussing to racial injustice, to Blackness, when we know of the mass cuts that could be facing the sector? We know historically that in moments of industry Armageddon, that minority identities and those most vulnerable are always the first in line to be made surplus. We saw in 2008 how women were evacuated from the creative industries as a result of mass cuts. There's very good reason to believe that ethnic minorities will be on the receiving end of exclusions from the industry as a result of the cuts being made to the cultural industries once we come out of this moment of lockdown. So what strategies can we use to sustain the interest of the cultural industries in Black life, inequality, when it could be that Blackness will be the thing that's evacuated from the creative industries once we come out of this moment? Lanre.
I was just thinking, I have no idea, Clive. I've been doing a lot of kind of doom journalism over the last few months, just about the state of the cultural landscape and how it's completely fallen away. And it's like theatre after theatre going under, productions getting pulled. I honestly don't have an answer. I know that's terrible, and that's kind of what I'm here for, and I should know. But I did a piece on theatre the other day, and we were talking about the kind of deep impact that this moment is going to have to a lot of cultural institutions that were already teetering, really on the kind of brink and struggling anyway. A lot of the artists directors were saying, we're going to try and keep our programming diverse because that's the kind of thing that actually gets people through the door. It's not going to someone that leads playoffs, and that's what they were saying. I'd love to believe that that's the case. I don't know how you hold them to account though, because they're going to be in a situation where they've got stakeholders, they're trying to kind of keep the thing going, and at the same time there's going to be people saying, well, actually, are you going to put on this like play about women from the Caribbean, or are you going to put on that Pinter play? Are you going to put on Betrayal again because we know it's going to get people through the door? And they were saying that actually it's difficult to kind of predict what people are going to come through and see. So maybe the work that people have been doing for the last 30 years has actually worked and has actually impacted people. I don't know. I hope so. I'm not optimistic though.
Francesca?
I think for me, in a way, I'm less concerned with how do we ensure that industry maintains an interest in these issues, and more focused on how can we support and sustain community forms of organising and creativity. And actually, I think the most exciting work and art and media that is emerging is often sort of beyond the parameters of industry as you understand it. So I think right now I'm thinking less about how does industry feel about what's going on, and how might they continue to try and contribute to these sorts of conversations that we see happening within political, media and public domains. And I'm thinking a lot more about what's happening locally, or how are things different across various regions, and how can, as individuals or collectively, people be supporting the efforts of those who are often most ignored, most oppressed, and most likely to be exploited and treated badly by some of the organisations within the industry.
And finally, Bidisha.
Nothing much to add to it, except that I think actually lockdown's been very good for gaining perspective, and that part of the reason we're having this conversation now is that everyone's having a little think about where we're at. The Black Authors Guild just wrote a big letter to all the major publishers saying, look how undiverse the publishing industry is. And actually that letter couldn't have happened without the 3 months of lockdown having giving people an opportunity to gain some perspective. I think that slowly and painfully all the toxic matter is coming out, and that's going to be difficult and uncomfortable. And yes, there'll probably be about 2 years where we try to get back up to speed in terms of funding. But just to be positive, I also think that lockdown was only 3 months. I mean, there are like mass wars and civil wars going on globally, and I really think it's a form of Western narcissism to be whinging about 3 months that you had to spend at home. I don't think it's going to be that drastic. I think it's going to take just a little bit of time to re-engage with culture, but that the conversations have been started and they're not going to be silenced anytime soon.
Well, it's getting late. It's been really, really absorbing hour and 15 minutes, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to try and contain all these ideas, but there's so much to think around. All I can do is say a huge thank you to our participants, Bidisha, Lanre and Francesca, for some amazing insights and thoughts on the last 3 weeks and beyond. A huge thank you to the South London Gallery for facilitating this new series, Convergence. Please continue to check their website for further events in this series coming soon. And a huge thanks to all those who've actually participated in this event. And again, it's a very, very difficult last 3 weeks for many people in the UK, in the US and beyond. But there is some investment we're seeing in culture as being a response to racial injustice currently. But as Bidisha, as Lanre, as Francesca and myself have explored today, we still need to retain some kind of skepticism and inquiry into the ethics and the motivations of our cultural institutions when they talk about diversity, when they talk about structural racism. We have to think about how rapid the change from those language to the language we're seeing now have taken place, and how they've identified the structural racisms within institutions within a short space of time. We can only see what happens in the coming weeks and months to see if those commitments are genuine. Thank you again, and yeah, very, 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 very intense conversation, but thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
Cheers.